listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. We're always being told how expensive groceries are and that inflation has caused irreparable damage to how much we'll pay at the checkout, all very doom and gloom. But here at The Briefing, we think it's time we took back control of our wallets and stopped paying so much. How? With 10 of the best hacks available right now to get around those exy supermarket trips.
People are shopping later in the day or later in the week in order to try and take advantage of the products that are marked down at that time.
The top 10 hacks to get around an exy grocery bill coming up in the second half of this episode. But first, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Tuesday, the 18th of March.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. We know polls aren't the be-all and end-all, but a new one today will be giving Anthony Albanese a bit of a pep in his step. The latest Guardian Essential survey of more than 2,200 voters has given the PM his highest approval rating since the failed Voice to Parliament referendum, and that was almost 18 months ago. It's up 4 points to 46%, while his disapproval rating has dropped to 45%. It's hard to say what might have impacted these numbers for Albo, maybe his decisive response to Cyclone Alfred, the Medicare funding announcement, or getting tougher on speaking about Donald Trump, despite Australia missing out on tariff exemptions.
Yeah, Peter Dutton, meantime, has copped his highest disapproval rating since the polls started tracking him 2 years ago. He's sitting at 46% compared with 41% who thought he was doing a good job. Now, the survey did check in with voters on one of his policy announcements, and that was forcing the public sector back into the office full-time, so cancelling work from home. 39% of the people surveyed in this poll were against that idea. 31% did say they supported it, but interestingly, disapproval from women, rather, was much higher than it was from men, which makes sense to me because, you know, you think of women who kind of are keeping all these balls in the air, trying to look after kids and being able to work from home is a really massive benefit to them. So I understand why they weren't happy at the idea that they might have to return to going into the office full time.
As someone whose friends are now starting to have kids, which is so terrifying for me in my mid-20s that this is already happening to me, this is a massive topic of discussion because they don't understand how they're meant to, you know, raise children plus be in the office 5 days a week. So this is one of the big policy announcements that the Libs and the Coalition have come out with that a lot of young people and young parents are looking at going, oh, you're not winning a vote here.
Look, also the poll did look at the two-party preferred vote, which does remain neck and neck, 47% to Labor, 47% to the Coalition, and 6% of voters in this poll were undecided. Now, we are continuing to see some tough talk on Trump from Labor meantime. We know Jim Chalmers is going to make this major speech today. We did talk about it yesterday on the headlines. We're getting some more information, some more leaks from what will actually be included in this speech, and he's going to argue that Australia deserves better from a long-term ally while warning Trump's trade war could cost our economy billions. Now, Trump, we know, is enforcing steel and aluminium tariffs worth 25%. We've talked about how, you know, US exports of steel from Australia are worth about 1% here. So it's not going to have that huge impact. However, we know that Trump wants to expand tariffs to almost all imports by April, and that would massively hit our beef and our pharmaceutical industries. So that could increase and widen that impact, and Jim Chalmers is going to talk about that today. And I also wanted to mention quickly before we move on to the next story, we have heard of a potential new policy from the Coalition and from Peter Dutton. Now, apparently he is considering his own referendum if he becomes Prime Minister.
I know,
not again. I hear a lot of people joining you in that groan. Apparently top-level meetings within the Coalition have recently discussed changing the Constitution to allow ministers to cancel the citizenship of people who are guilty of crimes like terrorism. And this would impact dual nationals, so people who have citizenship in another country, their Australian one would be cancelled and they would then be deported. Now, this would be part of the Coalition's plan to toughen the requirements for Australian citizenship. Whether he announces it as part of the election campaign remains to be seen.
To the US now, where Donald Trump says he and Vladimir Putin will speak over the phone tomorrow to discuss an end to the war with Ukraine.
A lot of work's been done over the weekend.
We want to see if we can bring that war to an end. Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but I think we have a very good chance.
The US president speaking from Air Force One there yesterday. As to what would be on the agenda, he had this to say.
It's a lot of land. It's a lot different than it was before the war, as you know. And we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power plants. But I think we have a lot of it already discussed very much by both sides, Ukraine and Russia, dividing up certain assets.
Yeah, and just on that power plant thing that he's mentioned there, that's most likely referring to Europe's largest nuclear plant, which is in Ukraine's southeast and is currently occupied by Russia. So very, very interesting to see if that's something that the US and the Ukraine ultimately is willing to cede to Russia in these talks. Look, the Kremlin has confirmed the call will happen, but has not commented on what exactly will be discussed, whether land and power plants will be discussed. However, over the weekend, we did hear from senior officials in Russia that they would not be budging when it comes to Ukraine's, air quotes, neutrality, insisting it must remain outside of NATO. And it comes as meetings between American negotiators and both Russia and Ukraine continue this week. President Volodymyr Zelensky firmed that Ukrainian sovereignty is not up for grabs.
Yeah, and it was just last week Putin revealed he was open to this US proposed 30-day ceasefire backed by Ukraine, but not until certain details, including the origins of the war, were agreed on. And that's all at the centre of a recent US decision to withdraw from an international coalition which was formed to investigate those responsible for starting the war on Ukraine, including Putin and any alleged war crimes as well. Now, this comes 2 years after the Biden administration first joined the group, at the time contributing $1 million in a show of support for the people of Ukraine. This is the latest in a string of cost-cutting measures that is also being read by some as this tilt towards a pro-Russian America, which is really hard to believe that we are here and that we are talking about that.
And that group, which involves countries like Estonia, Lithuania, and of course Ukraine. As to the US's role in that, they provide logistical help, training, and they direct assistance to the overburdened Ukrainian prosecutors who at the moment are investigating over 150,000 possible war crimes. Now that includes execution of prisoners, targeted bombings, and torture. So what the US was doing here was providing manpower and support to get through that huge backlog. If you're a Trump supporter, you're reading this as good diplomacy. You're saying, this is great because you're not pointing the finger at Putin. You're not putting him in the limelight, which, could help him come to the table. This is negotiation 101. Whereas everyone else who isn't a Trump supporter is kind of going, this is another slap in the face to Ukraine, which, I don't know, depending on how these talks go, it's anyone's guess as to what the intention was behind this. And on the topic of the ceasefire and this phone call between Putin and Trump, let's be clear, no one expects the conflict to end tomorrow. That's not what's being discussed here. It's all about making sure that ball is continuing to roll and move in favour of some sort of peace.
Nearly half of Aussie Year 6 students can't tread water for 2 minutes or swim 50 metres. Now, this is according to new research by Royal Lifesaving Australia, and it's found kids' swimming skills have gone down nationwide and for a number of reasons. One of them, the cost of living, with less and less people able to actually afford lessons, and because over a third of schools don't actually offer learn to swim programs at all, which is mind-boggling to me. I learnt from kindy to year 8, like all the way through. Parents not having enough time to take their kids to lesson has also factored in as a contributor. Now, the national guidelines say we should have these basic skills by the time we're about 12, which is year 6. But the teachers who were surveyed estimated nearly half of their classes weren't able to complete these skills. And that didn't get much better by the time they were in year 10, when students are normally about 15 or 16.
So what is the body saying we should do to address it? Well, funding is a massive one. Royal Lifesaving is calling on the government to help schools pay for programs and also offer grants to vulnerable groups. Spending cash on more public swimming pools is another, so there's more access to pools. And look, I don't think we can ignore the COVID effect. I mean, I hate talking about this pandemic over and over again, but that played a big part in this too. There's whole cohorts of kids that never learnt to swim because they couldn't go to those facilities to learn at the time. So I can imagine there's at least, 1, 2 or 3 whole year groups that just don't have these skills.
The latest stats in terms of drowning as well, which I thought was worth mentioning in relation to this story, show there was a 16% increase in fatal drownings across Australia, and that was from June 23 to June 24. So that is a really big increase. Interestingly, a lot of the conversation around swim safety and swim lessons and how to prevent drownings, this angle of kids being taught, obviously that's a key part. But in 2022, this kind of new approach launched and it was called Float to Survive. And this was about simplifying the message around water safety. And this was for vulnerable groups that don't speak English as a first language or, immigrants and refugees, because the idea is that if you're in trouble, the worst thing you can do is panic and to kind of wave your arms around. And this happens in pools, this happens in the ocean, in rivers, everywhere. This campaign started to teach people how to just float.
Yeah.
Getting that basic has had to form part of these new initiatives.
Yeah, and honestly, you're giving me such strong flashbacks at the moment to when I was learning to swim. It was the whole first few weeks and lessons was all about floating and squeezing your butt and pushing your butt up. And I just remember my uncle trying to drum that point home, and it got to a point where we had those little floaty boards and he would prop that underneath me and he'd be like, this is how you do it. So thank you to my uncle for teaching me how to swim based on floating.
Well, it's interesting you mention your family because, this research said that parents are playing and families are playing a really crucial role in their kids' swimming education. I know for me, I was taught by my parents. We were lucky enough to live somewhere that had a pool, and so every afternoon during summer, my mum and dad would take me down and I'd be like 1, 2, 3 and they'd be holding me up and teaching me how to float. Same thing, blow bubbles, all of that. It's really interesting that, parents are saying, I don't have the time, I don't have the money, I don't have the energy to do this. But it's a reminder, especially living in Australia, just how important it is to learn how to swim.
And we now know what will feature on our $5 note. The RBA has revealed the new design will celebrate Australia's Indigenous culture and connection to the land, with submissions now open for artworks. You might remember after the Queen died, there was a lot of chatter about whether the reigning monarch should continue to feature on our $5 notes, with the decision made to not put King Charles's face on the new one in February of 2023.
Yeah, he is on the coins, however. I did get a King Charles coin the other day. I was very excited. Now, the Queen had been the face of the note since 1992. That was her 40th year on the throne, which is so crazy to think about. She'd already been on the throne for 40 years by then. Now, the new theme, which will celebrate, as you said, Indigenous connection to the land and the overturning of Terra Nullius, was chosen from more than 2,000 submissions made to the Reserve Bank, and entries for the redesign close next month, Chris.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a step in the right direction, although I will say at the time when we were floating different ideas around, I was scrolling through Reddit and a few great suggestions came up. There was a really cool mock-up of Steve Irwin, which I thought, oh, that's really cute, paying homage to the great man. And at the time, seeing all the different mock-ups and the possibilities was super cool to see. But yeah, like I said, great to see where we've landed.
I think we'll always hope for the fun angle. For me, it'd be meat pie and fairy bread. You know what I mean?
They're great options.
But we have to go for something that, is going to stand the test of time. And obviously our Indigenous culture is really important to pay tribute to. And it's worth noting on the other side is an image of Parliament House, and that's also going to stay. So yeah, when we can expect these new $5 notes, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how long it takes to then have the image mocked up onto a note and printed and all of that. But we know submissions close in April. So maybe by the end of the year? I don't know. I just made that up off the top of my head. Chris, thank you. Next up, we are getting into our deep dive looking at how to hack your next trip to the supermarket. And I'm talking how to get your groceries cheaper. What I'm about to tell you is nothing new. Grocery prices are cooked. So cooked, in fact, they've increased by an average of 30% across Coles, Woolies and even Aldi over the last 3 years, according to new analysis by News Corp. In January alone, Australians spent $14.6 billion at the supermarket, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And that's compared to $11.5 billion back in January 2020. Obviously, we know what happened that year. COVID came knocking and caused supply chain issues and eventually soaring inflation. But even with the pandemic pressures well behind us and inflation easing, we are still forking out big bucks just to do our weekly shop. We also know that the cost of living is going to be a major vote driver for most of us this federal election, with questions around which party, if any, can make a difference. It feels very doom and gloom, but we are coming to you with the solutions today on The Briefing with 10 ways to hack your next grocery shop. Graham Cooke is the head of consumer research at Finder, and he joins me now. Graham, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing today. I feel like we've been talking about grocery prices really since COVID. Is it shocking to you that we've seen this analysis come out that prices have risen 30% just in the last 3 years alone?
Yeah, not really. So this is actually from our consumer sentiment tracker research. We've been doing this research for quite a few years in Australia, and it shows that the amount of money that a couple with one child say they spend weekly in groceries has gone up from $213 to $270 since June 2022. So it's a pretty significant increase. The one kind of caveat I would say to this is that this is what people say they spend. Often you find if people's spending starts to go down, it'll take a while for them to kind of realize that and cognitively say, oh, I'm actually spending less. And we are seeing other numbers, CPI numbers, which are showing that inflation is starting to ease. So it might mean that even though these costs are pretty high, we might be kind of nearing the end of this high pressure cost of living period. And I think that will be good news to many households.
Yeah. So what are the factors at play? You just mentioned inflation. How much of a role has that had in jacking up our prices so much over the last few years? And what else are we seeing have an impact?
Yeah, inflation is the measure of prices going up rather than kind of the cause of prices going up. But there's things behind that cause. Obviously, around the time of COVID, we had significant disruption to the supply chain globally. Then towards the end of that, we had wars starting in places like Ukraine, which pushed up the cost of fertilizer. In Australia, too, because we produce all of our fresh fruit and vegetables locally, 95% or something nearly that high is all grown locally. Local weather events tend to affect prices quite dramatically, and we have seen quite a few. We saw, dramatic fires for a couple of years there, and then flooding. We've seen that cyclone most recently in Queensland. So all of that kind of stuff, anything that affects farmers or production or distribution will have an inflationary effect on prices. But it's not just Australia. We have also seen inflation of grocery prices in the US particularly, which is one of the reasons behind Trump's re-election, in the UK and Europe. So it's not an Australian only problem.
We know that inflation is starting to go down. We haven't yet seen that have an impact on our grocery prices. Will it? I think there's this idea that, once the prices go up, they rarely come back down. We might not see them continue to rise, but they kind of stay up there. You might get a little bit cheaper here and there. We're never going to go back to paying, significantly less for our groceries, are we? This is the new normal.
You're probably not going to go all the way back, no, but we are seeing some deflation. So particularly fruit and veg has seen some deflation over the last number of months, because that's a category which is very heavily affected by distribution and production and stuff. So we have seen some prices go down, but that tends to affect more the kind of the fresh side of things rather than the pre-packaged product side of things in the rest of the supermarket. So you're not going to see prices go all the way back. You will start to see some easing, but inflation is looking good. So the inflation figure is now within the RBA's target range of 2 to 3%. That's why we saw that cash rate cut just recently. The government and the RBA will be keeping a close eye on those inflation numbers, though. And as long as they don't track up again, we should hopefully see another cash rate cut in March, which will be further relief for households as well. But obviously, there's a lot happening in the world right now. Who knows where we'll be next week?
Now, I want to put it back in our own hands, because as much as we can talk about how tough things are, we also have power. We are consumers. We can make choices that save us money and, maybe stick it to the big guys a little bit. Now, Finder has put together this list of 10 hacks for your grocery bill so that you can spend a bit less. And I want to go through them today and explain why they save us money and how they save us money. So let's start with the number one that's listed in Finder's hacks list is shopping at night. What difference does that make?
People are shopping later in the day or later in the week in order to try and take advantage of the products that are marked down at that time. So when products come towards the end of their expiry, they'll usually mark them down. You can get, more than 50% discounts in some cases, and they'll all be kind of gathered together in one part of the chilled section. So we're seeing quite a few people report that they're timing their shopping to go later in order to avail of these price markdowns, which is obviously a great way to save. But if you're doing that, just make sure that the expiry date is within the range of when you hope to use those products.
The next one is using an app for specials and savings. Now, I'm really bad at this. Which ones should we be using for groceries, and how do they help us save money?
There are quite a few apps available that can give you some cash back if you use them when you're shopping for your groceries. Grow My Money is one. You've also got Shop Back and Cash Rewards. All of those, where you sign up, you can do your shopping in one of the big supermarkets and you get cash back in some way. With Grow My Money, you'll actually get money back that you can put against your home loan or your super, which could give you even more value back over the kind of longer term and help you pay off your home loan quicker, or maybe have a bit more in your nest egg for retirement. So things like that are worth looking at. Usually doesn't cost you anything, and you can get a little bit more back from your shopping.
And on that same vein is joining something like a rewards program. Coles, I think it's Flybuys, and for Woolworths, it's Everyday Rewards. Are they worth doing as well?
In other countries, in the UK, there's far more of an emphasis on shoppers having to sign up for, it's the club card with Tesco over there. And actually Tesco over there, which is one of the big supermarket brands, have deeper discounts that are only available to people who sign up for the card. So you get 10% off, or you get 20% off if you sign up for the card. And everybody then signs up for the card in store. We started to see that a little bit here a couple of years ago, but then supermarkets kind of pulled back on it, I think, because of negative feedback from consumers. So you don't get necessarily those deeper discounts only available to card holders, but you will get specials that are kind of coming directly to you. You will get points for your spending. If you sign up for extra elements of those programs like the everyday delivery from Woolworths, you can get even more points, and you can then use those to save money on your shopping, or you'll actually get better value generally if you use those and convert them to frequent flyer points and try and use them for, say, a classic awards flight with Qantas. That could be kind of one of the better ways to get a decent value back from your spending.
So another one people obviously talk about as a hack, which isn't really a hack anymore because so many people do it, which is go to Aldi. But Finder specifically says to go to Aldi for staples. Why is that?
We're seeing it's 32% of families are shopping in more than one grocery store every week, and Aldi is usually the alternative that they're going to. What we tend to find is people go there and buy staples because Aldi is cheaper, but they've got a massively reduced range of products. It's about a tenth of the range that you get in Woolies or Coles. So people will go to Aldi to buy the staples, the bread and the butter and the cereal and all that everyday things, and then maybe go to Woolies or Coles or the local grocery shop to get the kind of more personal favorites and that type of thing. That tends to be the way we're seeing people split the shop. But Aldi's certainly doing very well out of this cost of living crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Buy-in season's another big one. Talk us through how important that is.
You know, this one is really big, particularly in Australia. One of the great things about Australia is that almost everybody buys all of their fruit and veg locally produced. Something like 95% of the fruit and veg sold in Australia is produced in Australia. Because of that, it's very susceptible to seasonal fluctuations. So you'll see, online social media bursts into rage sometimes when, a punnet of blueberries is $8 or that type of thing. That tends to happen when things are out of season and prices go up dramatically. If you buy stuff in season, if you buy berries around Christmas time, for example, you'll get those at really good prices. So buying what's fresh, being in tune to Mother Nature in Australia will get you the best deal.
But also in the same list, you have buy frozen or tinned. So is that to maybe curb stuff that's not in season, or is that for another reason?
That's will give you access to stuff when it's not in season, yeah. But frozen food tends to have a bad name, I suppose, especially if you ever watched anything with Gordon Ramsay in it. Tends to have a pretty bad name. But actually, frozen veg, particularly, if it's produced and frozen pretty soon to when it's picked, which it tends to be, especially for things like peas and beans and stuff, then it will usually kind of lock in nutritional value, vitamins and minerals pretty early and hold those in place. It might not have the texture of the kind of fresh stuff, but it will have the vitamin and mineral content.
Let me add my own hacks to that because it's hot at the moment. We've been doing a lot of salads at home, and one way I've found to bulk up a salad is to use tinned like 4-bean mix and tinned corn as well. Same thing. It's so much cheaper than trying it. Well, except for, sweet corn is in season at the moment, so it's cheaper. But yeah, it's a really easy way to just bulk up your salad. And the other thing, a friend of mine cooked frozen veggies for me the other day on the barbecue, and that really got some of that awful frozen food texture out of it. It was charred and it was really nice. So there we go. That's how to make it taste better, if our listeners were wondering, not just saving money, but also make it taste good.
Yeah, but if you're doing kind of shepherd's pie, if you're doing mince pies, any of that kind of stuff that like make at home beef mince. You know what we're sure you go there? It's actually lentils. If you buy a tin of lentils, drain them and put those in, that can be a great way to bulk those up, and they actually absorb the flavour of the meat really well, and they're pretty nutritious, and it reduces your meat intake and therefore reduces your carbon footprint. So it's a win-win.
Graham, maybe we should start a cooking podcast. I feel like we're onto something here.
Yeah.
There's a couple more that we got to get through. Going to specialty stores, and I'm guessing what also ties into that is another hack, which is finding a co-op, a farmer's market or local growers. How can that impact our grocery bills?
Yeah, that can save you an awful lot if you're buying from fresh markets or fresh local veg producers, for example, because you're really buying at the kind of directly from the supply chain in that case. Not all the time you're going to get cheaper, but often, if you go to those places and keep an eye on the lowest possible prices, again, look for what's in season. It can be a great way to kind of get groceries quite cheap. And we're seeing a lot of markets kind of offer a mixed box of random veg where you don't necessarily know what you're getting, but you pay $10 or $15 or whatever, you can get a box of super fresh vegetables. And then you take those home and you have a little bit of a challenge in terms of how you're going to figure out how to cook it. And maybe you can introduce yourself to some new recipes and new flavors as well.
And the last one is make a meal plan and a shopping list and stick to it. Why does this make a difference to how much we end up spending in the end?
One of the ways I've been managing to avoid the impulse spending is doing this, putting a list together, but then shopping online rather than going into the store. You can pay an annual fee of $100 or whatever. You can then order shopping to your house once it reaches $75 as regularly as you want. So that saves us an awful lot of time. But the great thing about shopping online is that you're not walking down the aisle and tempted by the delicious Whittaker's chocolate or the brie and cheese and crackers and all that type of thing. I'm pretty susceptible to just throwing stuff in the trolley. So make a list, stick to it. But a great way to stick to it can be to shop online. And this is quite popular in Australia. We saw the number of people shopping online increase dramatically during COVID. And even though the cost of living crisis is biting, we have seen those numbers continue to increase. So Australians introduced to convenience never look back.
Hey, look, Graham, before we go, thank you for taking us through those hacks. I think a lot of them they all make sense, really, and it's just something that we can remind ourselves that we do have power, we do have some control over how much we are paying when we go through the checkout. But I guess the last question I want to ask you is, people say, the government can do whatever they want. They can make prices come down at the drop of a hat. Is there something Labor could do right now, whether it would drive up inflation or not, that would cut grocery prices? Or is it kind of out of their hands to the point that the supermarkets set the prices, there's a bunch of different factors at play, and we're just victim to it at the end because we have to do our grocery shopping?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a free market for supermarkets, but there is competition between the two in order to keep prices down relatively. Like as soon as one goes down, the other will usually follow suit. There's way more focus on grocery prices now than I think ever before because of this cost of living crisis. Everybody's talking about it continuously, which can only be a good thing. In a market like this, in the end, the power is with the consumer. If it's too expensive in your local supermarket, go to your local supplier. Look for other options. I mean, Amazon have recently started to get into delivering pantry products, so not fresh products, but a lot of the other products in the supermarket shelves. And they are actually competitive with supermarkets a lot of the time and will deliver stuff next day if you're one of the big capital cities in Australia. So cast your net wide, use your consumer power, and only shop where you feel you personally are getting a decent deal.
Graham Cooke from Finder, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us on the briefing today.
Thank you, Sacha.
We'll also put all the Finder hacks in the show notes of this ep for you to return to for your next shop. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. If you've got a mate or someone you know struggling to get their grocery bill down, why not send this ep to them? It really helps us get the briefing out there and in the ears of lots of different people. And so does sharing our socials posts. Check us out on Instagram. We're at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Tash is with you this Savo for the afternoon edition of The Briefing. And Chris and I will be with you tomorrow morning at 6 for the headlines and another deep dive.
Listener.